globe who are following our work, it could be, I think, 6 o'clock. Yeah, so it's 12 o'clock noon Central Time. That's where I am here in New Orleans. I am Dr. Cirecie West-Olatunji, and I am one of the co-founders of CRESTS-Achieve. And with me today, I have our other co-founder, Dr. West. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Dr. Constance West, and as Dr. West-Olatunji has said, I'm a co-founder of CRESTS-Achieve. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've done a lot of work with African American children and families in a variety of settings, and I'm really excited to um, join Dr. West-Olatunji today and to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess I should say a little bit about myself. I have specialized in multicultural counseling from the beginning of my training at the master's level, and then on at the doctoral level, and then as a career counselor educator, I've specialized in multicultural counseling research. I'm a past president of the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development. In terms of leadership, I'm a past president of the American Counseling Association as well, and I've also been a journal editor, editor of the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development. So this has been the focus of my research. At the same time, even as far back as my dissertation decades ago, I focused on Black youth and this issue of trauma related to environmental factors. And so I've been studying this issue for a very long time. In 2012, I was giving money to create the Center for Traumatic Stress Research, and that work continues. I started at another university and brought it with me to Xavier University, where I am now, returning to Xavier University. And we continue to do work in the area of traumatic stress as it relates to systemic oppression. So CREST-Achieve is really an outcome of both of our long careers in working with youth of color and Black youth in particular. I would say another piece that informs the work that I do is my work with rite of passage programs. I had the opportunity to serve as a counselor and also briefly as director of uh, a rite of passage program. And this rite of passage program at the time, pre-Katrina, was the longest running rite of passage program in the United States. And I had the opportunity to work under the founder of this rite of passage program, Dr. Morris F.X. Jeff. And Dr. Jeff taught me a lot about why he created that program, the different components of it. And of course, as a staff person, I was intricately involved in working with 75 boys Black boys between the ages of 8 and 18, and also helped to advance the curriculum that was there and to document it. And I've since written about it to tell other people. The research around rite of passage programs is quite solid, and so we definitely recommend that as one of the interventions when working with Black youth. So that is definitely an important part of my professional experiences that lend themselves to the work that we do. Of course, you can also go to our website where we have lots of resources in talking about work with Black youth. And we've got videos, podcasts, we have commissioned papers that you can read, newsletters, and so on. We will be developing practice briefs so that you can have a grab and go if you wanted to just learn about one particular intervention addressing a specific challenge or issue that your client or your student in your classroom has. So we'll be developing those practice briefs as well. So we encourage you to go there. And of course, we have ongoing trainings. Some of them are free, others are a series of trainings that you can pay for. But of course, our signature work is CRESTS-Achieve, the credentialing program that is actually designed for a whole school or school district, but we do make it available to individuals, individual parents, individual clinicians, school counselors, for example, or school social workers, school psychologists, and also for individual teachers and other educators and school personnel. And so you can definitely sign up for that. You can pre-register for that. It should be coming out in February. So we want to talk to you today about culture-centered trauma-informed care. And if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions in the chat. And we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. I think the first question is just, what's culture got to do with it? So why do we think it's so important to insert culture into the big business of trauma-informed care? So many of you, I'm sure, have gone to trauma-informed care training, as I have. And many of you may have sat in those trainings and asked, how does this relate to the children that I work with? And also I've had the opportunity to engage in needs assessments and conduct interviews, individual interviews, focus group interviews in communities that are predominantly Black. And the youth will say, I don't relate. The the kinds of interventions, the trauma interventions that they brought into the school, they'll say, those things are boring. I don't relate to them. And so we need to really think about that, about how can we make the training more uh, uh, relational. They need to be able to relate to the training. It's so important to understand that Black mental health is not the same and doesn't have the same goals as Eurocentric mental health. In other words, in the Black community, in Black culture, we have to ask, what does it mean to be emotionally and psychologically healthy? And to ask the question, is it the same as it is for other people? In other words, are there values within uh, the Black culture, like African culture in the diaspora, meaning Black people in the United States and the Caribbean, South America, Europe, on the continent of Africa, and so on? When we think about not focusing on Eurocentrism, we think about not focusing on Western values, and instead have at the center the values of the people that we serve. We have to ask, are the goals of mental health the same? So let's take one thing, for example, and that has to do with the issue of autonomy, and autonomy being a sign of wellness within a Eurocentric concept. And so a lot of the work that we do is designed to help people to be on their own, to be independent, and that's a good sign. And we don't look for them to be overly dependent, but overly is a term that is qualified. It's qualified by one's values. What is overly dependent? And so that's dictated by the people within the culture. So it's important for us to be able to ask questions when we're working with our clients of color, when we're working with Black clients, when we're working with Black youth. We need to begin to understand what are the assumed values, espoused values within their community, within their culture, and to know that we are bringing them closer to those values so that they're recognizable and they get the support within their system. So we always want to make sure that whatever counseling we're doing, whatever direction we're taking our clients, is within the context of their value system. We don't want them to be a stranger or alienated within their value system. We want it to be recognizable because then they get support. It makes sense. It's common sense to the people in their system. So that's the first point, and that is that we have to ask ourselves, is Black mental health the same as it is for basically the training that we receive in all of our mental health disciplines? And the answer is no, it is not. However, understanding Black mental health is something that often is not being taught in our programs. And so we need to go to other places, whether it's during our training, and we do sort of an underground training of our own outside of what it is that we're getting, or we get it after we graduate, after we've become independently licensed, and we begin to locate places where we can learn about culture-centered counseling and culture-centered interventions for educators, for example, finding out what does it mean to be able to work with Black youth so that they are socially and emotionally healthy. So, Dr. West, I know you've worked a lot with Black youth, certainly within the court system and working with adjudicated youth. And I'm sure that you've seen similar kinds of things where you've had to work with your clinical team to talk to them about ways in which they need to specifically work with Black youth.
Absolutely. I think that, so one of the things that happened when I started working for the Fulton County Juvenile Court, I worked there for 8.5 years as the lead of their mental health clinic, was I noticed that when I first arrived that the overwhelming majority of the psychological evaluations that were court ordered for youth served through our court, who were predominantly, overwhelmingly African American, typically African American males. These evaluations are being conducted by psychologists who are typically white or Caucasian women. And so, so there was already a situation in which there was the potential, at least, for difficulty relating to the youth if those evaluators weren't well trained in African American culture and looking at understanding the experiences of Black youth, particularly young Black boys, and both children and predominantly adolescents. And so what I would find oftentimes is that when I reviewed a lot of the psychological evaluation reports, the overwhelming majority of African American boys, particularly older boys, teenagers, were being diagnosed with a conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, independent of whatever sorts of experiences they'd had related to being traumatized, either losing parents, having parents who were incarcerated, being in schools that were predominantly white and experiencing daily experiences of race-based trauma. And what I found was that when we did have Caucasian youth who were coming through the court, their evaluations indicated they were depressed or anxious, and they were treated differently within the court system. And so one of the things that I had to do was to go back and revamp that to, number one, try to recruit more psychologists of color, not just of color though, but of color and who had training and experience in dealing with African American culture, particularly African American boys. The other thing was to go back and help with the training or retraining or specialized training of those evaluators who were open to that, who were Caucasian or Caucasian females, and help to talk to them about maybe using different interviewing techniques to understand African American culture, to be open to receiving that type of input without feeling threatened or being defensive, and sort of going through and helping them to see, the review of their evaluation reports and see what the patterns were, and to help them to make some differences. And sometimes it meant we had to sit in on some of those sessions. Sometimes it meant we had to provide them with different assessment instruments. Sometimes we had to give them research articles that indicated, you know, what they needed to consider and how to, maybe certain types of assessments weren't appropriate, the interpretation needed to be different, and to not misinterpret behavior. So sometimes not answering a question doesn't mean you're being oppositional. It may mean that you don't feel comfortable talking about that, that it may indicate that that is the exact area of trauma. So oftentimes African American boys did not answer questions about their fathers, and they would just say, I don't want to talk about it. When if you dig a little bit deeper, you would find out the reason they don't want to talk about it or why they left that question blank was because they did feel a sense of loss, anger, abandonment, trauma related to that. And so oftentimes it was like, oh, he didn't say anything, so he didn't have any feelings about that, as opposed to what's the pattern of unwillingness to discuss a topic, and what does that indicate? Does that indicate someone being oppositional, or maybe being uncomfortable in that setting, or not feeling they can relate to you, and or not being willing to talk about something that is very emotional laden, as opposed to just being defiant. And so it was about walking through all of those steps. And in some situations we were very successful, and other times we had to seek different providers. But the overwhelming majority of those providers were open. And then also dealing with family members, because sometimes the families were coming in saying that there was a problem with the child, or the child was just a so-called bad child, and helping them to also reinterpret their children's behaviors as indications that there's something going on with them in terms of trauma, in terms of depression, in terms of grief, so that we didn't end up in a situation in which the court system was saying the child was just defiant and disrespectful, and the school was saying the same thing, and then the parents were saying the same thing. In those situations, you think about what those outcomes would look like. So we're talking about detention, we're talking about adjudication, oftentimes not being required to have mental health services, because of course they would indicate that the child didn't have depression or anxiety or PTSD or trauma-related conditions. So really working with everyone within the court system, so evaluators, so clinicians, parents, caregivers, teachers, probation officers, even attorneys, to understand the nuances of African American culture and how that impacts the assessment process, the interpretation of data collected, and the ways in which we determine what is a successful outcome versus the unsuccessful outcome with regard to education, with regard to clinical services, with regard to interactions with the court system, etc. So definitely have seen the importance of looking at our children, or African American children, as being healthy or embodying healthy emotional development, as being differently defined and differently assessed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very, very good examples from your experiences. I think it makes it very clear that we need specialized training to be able to work with Black youth. And we're not saying state and trait. So it's not, oh, you're Black, you can work with Black youth. No, you need to be trained. As a matter of fact, you need to decolonize your training, because even, everyone is getting the same training that is Eurocentrically based. And so all of us need to be retrained. So that's number one. And that's what we're offering. Second about that is that I also heard you say that everybody, so you don't need to be Black in order to be able to be effective in working with Black youth. So I heard you saying that about there being counselors who are not Black, about mental health professionals who are not Black, about educators who are not Black, even parents who are not Black, parents of Black youth that are not Black. So we know that there are folks who can do a great job in intervening and supporting, developing Black youth and leading them toward academic excellence and socio-emotional well-being. And so I heard both of those as being strong themes in you elaborating on this issue, that Black mental health is not the same as white mental health, and that we need to excise the Eurocentrism out of our work with Black youth. There's a question, thank you for the clap back. Uh, and there was a question coming in from Ashley. Also, I want to say hey to Lydia. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you coming. So yeah, so this idea of youth and their value system being different from their parents. So let's separate out some of these things. First of all, you've got the developmental push of the developmental challenge of youth needing to move away from their parents, and there being that conflict as they grow up and so on. And they are going to, in many ways, be oppositional. You know, it's as they go into adolescence, there's this issue of, you know, whatever I do, I'm not going to be like adults, whatever that is, and so on. And so we get that, but it's needed. We understand that that's part of the growth process. The struggles that they have, the conflicts that they have, and so on, are part of the growth process. I wouldn't consider that to be different value systems. That's just different developmental stages. And the natural conflict that occurs, the natural conflict that occurs when youth are going through their developmental stages. So I would start with that in terms of understanding the conflicts that might exist between youth and their parents, particularly teens, adolescent years, and so on. And so it's important. And again, I would emphasize reading and becoming familiar with what does adolescence look like for Black youth, and understanding that. One of the key aspects of adolescent development is identity. So when we look at Black youth, Black adolescents, we understand that for us as parents, as educators, as clinicians, that we need to focus on racial cultural identity development for Black youth. There is a plethora of research. We've got about 3 decades of research about racial cultural identity development and Black youth. And what we've learned is that there is a strong correlation between racial cultural identity development and emotional well-being and academic excellence for Black youth. So it's important for us to think about that in terms of the conflicts going on between Black teens and their parents, is to think about whether or not we as parents, we as educators, we as clinicians are providing youth, Black youth, with enough understanding of who they are within their own racial cultural group, so that they build a strong identity that we know from the research serves as a buffer against race-based stress. So we have to really think about that, to think about what is the cause? How do we, disentangle the conflicts that may exist between teens and their parents, to understand, is it just normal developmental things? Is it related to race-based stress? What do we need to do about that? Or is it a value difference? And if so, how did that develop? So let's take a look at that, the latter, value difference. Similar to the work that's been done around immigrant children or children of immigrants, right? Where we get a lot of that parent-child conflict, is because the youth have embraced Eurocentric values. They have assimilated into Western values. And so those Western values are in the home, and we get that conflict. So again, we're back to this issue of racial cultural identity development, right? That is a key piece. It's a linchpin in terms of helping Black youth to succeed in life, right? So that is something that we want to take a look at in doing that. So just like we do when we're working in general with our clients from a clinical perspective, mental health, those mental health folks that are out there, we have to start with assessment, right? We need to begin there rather than jumping to interventions. Let's do a better job of assessment first to figure out what's going on. And certainly with Black youth and the conflict with their parents, we need to tease out all these different things that might be a part of that and be able to figure out what pieces are contributing to that. What do we need to work with first? We need to research and find out what evidence-based practices have been shown to be effective for any one of those issues that contribute to the problem that the child brings. So I would suggest that to be able to uh, discombobulate all of those things, to disaggregate what we're seeing as a presentation, and then determine what's the most intense or acute issue that needs to be dealt with. And as we know, like at most clinical things, if you deal with the big thing, a lot of times the family, the child will take care of the other things. It's a domino effect. So a lot of times they're able to handle those things on their own once we clarify that. And I would suggest to you, based upon evidence that exists in the research, that I encourage you to start with racial cultural identity development. And whether that's things that you do in the home, and I'm sure Dr. West can talk about some of the things, she talks a lot about interventions in the home and things that parents can do. So whether that's intervening within the home, there's lots of evidence. I've conducted that research myself about what parents can do in terms of working with Black youth. Also, we can talk about what interventions need to be done in schools that support Black youth. And then, of course, what things could be done in the clinical setting when we're working as mental health professionals with Black youth to be able to do that, and then go ahead and intervene. And then, of course, do your evaluation to see whether or not there is true evidence that things have changed. What do we see in terms of how they're performing in the school setting, how they're behaving at home, what are their peer interactions like, and so on. So it's important to do that. I don't know if Dr. West wants to talk about that. There was the other piece of that question about what if there's a difference in terms of religion. And I would say that also is dictated by the values in the culture. So people having different religions or even different faiths within a religion is something that has existed for a long time. That's not where our major conflicts come from. And so we still need to deal with Black culture. What are the values, right? If we go way back to the basics, the 101 of multicultural, or the 101 of African-centered counseling, it is to really understand that Black people are not just white people and just not doing it as well. In other words, we're sort of a weaker version of white people, and that's not the case at all, right? So we have our own value system, and that's the basics of African-centered counseling, of African-centered education. We need to understand, what is our value system? What's our culture, right? Because that's not taught. It's not taught in school. It's not taught at home. And so we just, through osmosis, start believing that we don't really have a culture. And so it's important for us to start there with being able to articulate, one after another, all of the different aspects within our culture as Black people. Dr. West?
Oh my goodness, there's so much there. Dr. West-Olatunji covered a lot of base. I'm not sure where I want to end up commenting, but I have to say a couple of things. One is this whole idea of culture, the culture of African people or African American people or people of the African diaspora. What is our culture? I think a lot of times culture is one of those things that you experience, but you can't really put your hand on it unless you've really done a lot of work related to that and been trained in that area. And so there is this idea that African Americans don't have a culture. I remember one of the most disturbing interactions that I had with a psychologist working in the court was I was trying to explain to her African American culture and how that was causing a challenge for her to handle with respect to whether or not clients arrived on time. She had a policy that once you were 10 minutes late, that she just reported it to the probation officer. And often what would happen is the child would be detained so that the evaluation could happen because they were seen as being, not, well, being out of compliance with the judge's order. And so there was that piece. So I was sort of going through all the various issues. So it wasn't just culture, but culture did play a role. There were also things like, okay, some of these families have to catch 2 buses and a train, or they have multiple kids. They have to, they don't have their own transportation. So it was like a lot of different factors. But culture was definitely amongst the issues that I wanted to talk to her about so she would understand, and then to have her be open to being a little bit more flexible. So I remember her saying, "Oh, they have a culture?" She said, "Oh, are they Hispanic?" And I went, "What?" I was like, "No, they're African American." And her idea was that, well, then they don't have a culture. It only, I guess she had been trained to learn about, Hispanic or Latinx culture, but not about African American culture. And I was thinking, what? I'm so offended. I had to really take a deep breath and get myself together, because this is a person who was doing the overwhelming majority of the evaluations on our children through the court system. And so, and the way it worked is that the agency, we had an agreement with an agency, a government agency that provided free services. So this person's job was primarily to just come over and do our evaluations. And it was like, oh my goodness, how do we do this? Can we even negotiate to swap her out? Is she even going to be open to learning about culture? And I remember trying to talk to her. And at that moment, she was just like, no, 10 minutes is all they're getting. I'm going to go ahead and have this child detained. And I was like, do you understand what that would mean for the child? And I remember thinking, is this even ever going to work out? Is she ever going to be open to even thinking that African Americans have a culture and it was something worthy of consideration? But it took some time, but over time, I mean, she really did come around, and she actually went and did some cultural competency related training. And when I saw her, I was like, who is this woman? Because she had really made a lot of changes in terms of how she even interacted with other clinicians like myself. I mean, just in general. And then looking at her reports, they were so vastly different because she was aware of cultural differences, that African Americans have a culture and how that might impact everything. It was just like, she was like the poster child. But initially I was thinking, what? So if the clients are not Hispanic, then there's no reason to think about cultural issues. And you're talking to a person who's African American. I was so insulted and so hurt for our children. And I felt helpless because I wasn't sure I could negotiate maybe getting a different provider and insisting that she has some sort of training. But luckily that worked out. So this whole issue of we don't have a culture is an important thing. The other thing I want to give is an example. I remember just me as a child. I remember when I went from attending an African American school to attending a predominantly white school. This is, I want to say maybe I was in 4th or 5th grade. And I remember coming home from school and I said, Mom, I need to know who are my real relatives, who are my real aunties. And I remember, my mom got really angry because she was like, real? Who says real? And I'm like, no, my teacher said, who was a white teacher, told me that the definition of an aunt is the sister of either your mother or your father. So all these other aunties that I have are not real aunties. And I just need to go through my list of people I call aunt so-and-so. And I need to check off real or not real. I remember my mother would not cooperate. She was so hot. She was seriously considering removing me from that school. Because, of course, African American culture, the idea is that an aunt is not necessarily just the blood relative or the sibling of your, parents, the female sibling of one of your parents. It's the function of auntie, and it's also about the level of respect. So the way in which they function in your life, and also the level of respect that person has earned, determines whether or not they're considered to be an auntie. So it was sort of like, how dare someone else define from another culture what an aunt is supposed to be, and have it be that this child is coming back in the household saying, I have the actual definitive answer. And so it was this resistance that because a white person said it, or because my teacher said this, or because this is the mainstream culture, and it's saying this is this is who family members are. And that happens a lot, even when we think about if you're in the military, or if you're trying to get off from your job, they define who is a family member of primary significance, or I guess first degree. So it's like your aunt, your sometimes it's just your parents and your grandparents. It's not like, okay, you get 5 people and you pick who those 5 people are. It's they've already defined who those people are, and it may not fit with various cultural groups. And so it becomes this thing of people in power determine who's a real relative, or who's most important to who, and I think that there can be that situation when your children are going out to a school, whether it be that the children are going to a Catholic school and you're Protestant. It could be any of those things where the child is going out and being acculturated, adopting Eurocentric values and practices and or beliefs, and coming back home and introducing those into the home. And so it isn't necessarily a problem that they're bringing that in, but the question is, why are they bringing that in? Is it because this is the idea that people who are white or are Caucasian are the authorities on what is true? So that's the reality of it, and everything else is fake or wrong. That's one thing, versus maybe the person does grow up and determine that no, that they really do feel as though that's not what they want to believe in, or those are the practices. So it really is about assessing, why do you believe this? Why do you feel this way? And what does that really represent for you? And is that healthy or not healthy? When children are the only one in their household who feel and practice a certain thing, they could be really alienated, right? And so that's an important piece. They could be alienated from their family members, but also from their whole community. And then here they're out in other situations, and they may be experiencing race-based trauma. So now they're like completely out. They don't have, a whole network of people who are going to provide them with support, or they may feel as though they don't identify with their family or their community, and they don't identify, or they're not accepted by the broader culture, and so they can feel very alienated. And so it's important to be able to try to figure out, okay, what is this really about? And to be able to identify whether this is something that's healthy or not healthy, and to be able to help family members understand that. To a lot of times, family members aren't thinking that. They're thinking, oh, I'm just sending my child to this school because it's supposed to be a quote better school, but they don't realize that what's going to happen is their children are going to be exposed to this other set of cultural values and practices and beliefs that don't fit. So they can come home and tell you, oh, the fact that you do X, Y, and Z means you're not going to be welcome in heaven. Or they may say, you're a bad person because you do this thing, or I'm not like the rest of you. So you end up in this situation where you may have had really good intentions, but maybe didn't prepare your child for what they're going to experience out there, and to be prepared for what that will mean once that child comes back into the fold. What does that mean for possible conflict based upon a difference in cultural beliefs, values, or practices? And it's really important to inoculate your children against that. So you say, hey, you're going over there, but here's the deal. This is what we believe and think, and this is what you're going to be exposed to, and that's okay. That's just something that's different. It's not better, not necessarily worse, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're doing or what you see in your community or in your family is inferior or wrong or incorrect or something like that.
Absolutely. I can think of so many examples. I hear Black youth often when they're talking to each other. That's when you get a lot when you're listening to young people talk to each other. I'm not Black, really. I'm Panamanian. I'm not Black, really. I'm West Indian. I'm Jamaican. I'm this, I'm that. I'm not really Black, really. I'm Native American. I'm not really Black, really. My grandmother was white. I'm not Black, really. I'm Creole. So we've got all of these things, and that is the racial cultural identity issue of not being able to be very congruent in terms of, I know who I am, I know who my people are, I'm proud of my group, I support my group, I promote my group, and so on, rather than denigrating self and denigrating one's own reference group, because they typically also denigrate other marginalized people as well. And they are lifting up white culture, white values, and so on. But it causes all kinds of problems psychologically, and we get to see it in terms of both their physical and their emotional health. And so this is a critical issue that is really the linchpin in terms of working with Black youth. And almost all of our interventions need to be associated with that. And we need to ask ourselves, when children are being brought to us for behavioral problems, for underachievement in school, we need to ask ourselves, how are we supporting them and who they are? How do we create an environment that, as Dr. West said, inoculates them against race-based stress, which is the number one killer in our community. A couple of months ago, we had a session. It's available on our website and in our YouTube video, on our YouTube channel. And it was Unseen and Unheard, the rising rates of Black youth suicide. And so, you know, you're welcome to go and check it out. But that is a symptom of what's happening to Black youth, that we have this concern where they're trying to tell us something about what's wrong with the environment and how toxic the environment is for them. So we really do need to listen to them, not only in what they say, but also in their actions, their behaviors, to take a look at them in the school setting and see how they are searching for answers and how distressed they are in this environment. It's a very frightening world that we live in right now. Just start with the pandemic and understanding that the pandemic disproportionately impacts Black people in general. And then if we take a look at kids in school, K-12 for an example, and we think about it, K-12, when we're looking at mental health issues, kids who live in low resource school, who go to school in low resource schools, who live in communities that are disenfranchised, are overwhelmingly, disproportionately Black and brown. And so we know that they are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to what education looks like in the pandemic. And they're not being able to access resources and supports during this time of the pandemic. So they are disproportionately being impacted by COVID-19. And so we need to really pay attention to that now and in the future when the pandemic is over. Even before the pandemic, when we took a look at these low resource schools and the idea that, you know, from research, we know that the educational staff is not as strong. The quality of the teaching staff is not as strong as it is in more resource schools. We know that there are also issues around, you know, not even having the supplies and resources that they need to be able to be taught. We know that the courses being offered are not the same. They don't even have the advanced placement courses that are needed for them to go on to higher education in order to be competitive and so on. So there's a long list of issues that Black youth have. And I'm not saying that all Black youth are coming from low resource, low income communities, but I am saying that we are disproportionately represented in those communities. And then as you heard Dr. West talk about, even when we talk about children who are coming from middle class, upper middle class families, and they send their kids off to these high resource schools, they're having a different experience in those schools. So they're not getting the value of being there because of the way in which they are being marginalized in those school settings. And they experience a tremendous amount of socio-emotional distress that is not being addressed, not in the school setting. And oftentimes parents don't want to hear it because they're saying, hey, we are scraping to make sure that you go to this private school. And so we don't want to hear what you have to say. Just go there, enjoy it, take what they have to offer so you can be successful. So parents don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. I would imagine that a part of that is also that parents don't want to think too deeply about how they might have made a mistake with their children by sending them there. And so there's a lot of complex feelings that need to be dealt with. But again, the issue is that we need to concentrate on racial cultural identity development with Black youth in order for them to feel good about who they are, because they're getting 24/7 messages from the environment, from television, from the internet, from music videos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things that are very Eurocentrically focused, that do not uplift and promote who they are in a positive sense. So it's very important that we send a message to them that they have worth, they have value, they have things that contribute as human beings from their own culture. And that's important as well, to understand how have they as a people contributed. So often I hear not just children, but adults saying things like, Black people never contributed to anything. Black people don't do this. Black people don't do that. Black people can't do this. And I just hear that as the uneducated, that they don't know. No one's ever taught them so that they understand how Black people in the diaspora have contributed to just the world. And that's really important for youth to understand, that they belong to a community, to a culture that has greatly contributed to what exists out here in the world. And that's important. And it's also important for them to understand that they stand on those shoulders of people before them. So, as Marcus Garvey said, what man has done, man can do again. So when they see that it's been done before, they understand that they too can become an engineer, an architect, an astronaut, a nuclear physicist, an astrophysicist, a chemist, right? So they can be all of those things. They can be a world-renowned musician or ballerina or anything that they want to be, instead of listening to all these messages in the environment that say that they're not worth anything, because that is the message that is being sent to them through the media, all forms of media, and so on. So that's important. I appreciate that the link to the next training has been put up. We do have a Black History Month panel discussion. We are having the 3 authors of our commissioned papers that are on our website. We have Dr. Melanie Acosta, Dr. Samuel Burbanks, and Dr. Jimmy Caldwell, who all wrote beautiful, beautiful papers that are on our website. You also can go and check out their videos. They were interviewed by our grad assistant. And so you can take that. But I have been so impressed by these papers that I thought, hey, let's bring all 3 of these powerful, fiery, dynamic faculty, scholars. Let's bring them together. They don't know each other. I don't think they do. But we're going to bring them together for a panel discussion next month, February 8th, on Tuesday at the same time. And it will be through Eventbrite. So I believe that Ashley has put the Eventbrite link in the chat, but we'll start putting it out on social media. You can look it up on Eventbrite. And I can't remember, what is the title, Dr. West? I think it's From Transgenerational Trauma to Transgenerational Resilience. And they're going to talk about it from an educational perspective, from a mental health perspective, and so on. They are phenomenal. They're all educators. And they're going to talk about this from all those perspectives. I think you'll really enjoy it. I hope you'll be able to join us. We are coming up on our hour. We've already passed the 45-minute hour. You guys have stayed with us. You've asked great questions. Feel free to email us at CRESTprogram at gmail.com. If you have additional questions that you didn't get a chance to add to the chat, I see Ashley has put the actual title of next month's webinar in the chat, so you have that. Please take a look at it. We're also going to get it uploaded to our website, so all you have to do is go to the website, click on the link, and register so you can join us. But it is going to be exciting. And Ashley Petillon, who is soon to be Dr. Ashley Petillon, will be the moderator because she interviewed all three of these scholars, and she will come in and debut as moderator next month, and you'll see more from her. We look forward to seeing you. Dr. West, did you have any closing comments?
No, I don't want to say too much, but I just want to thank everyone who has been participating in terms of asking questions or making comments. This is always a very lively conversation, and I'm looking forward to hopefully having all of you who participated in this particular event to join us in our upcoming events, including the panel, which is going to be super exciting next month. I am so excited about that. So hopefully you'll be able to join us, and you can share the link with your colleagues, family members, friends, etc.
Absolutely. We look forward to seeing you again. Reach out to us in social media. Tell your friends. Join us next month. We'd love to have you. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us. Or if you're over in the UK, across the ocean, and you're in Europe, as we've had people before, it must be dinner time for you as well. So thank you so much. And for those of you who are watching the video, that'll be posted on the CRESTS-Achieve website, Facebook page. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email us. We'll be glad to answer. So thank you so much for being with us today. Have a good one. All right. Peace and blessings.
Bye.
Bye-bye.